What if everything you think you know about Lampião collapses the moment you step into the shadows of a place no outsider was ever meant to see? What if, behind the legendary hat, the polished leather, and the romantic myths of the Cangaço, there existed a hidden camp where fear ruled more fiercely than any bullet, and where 7 brutal practices shaped the psychology of every man and woman who dared to call themselves This is the side of Lampião that history rarely confronts, that one not sung in cordel poetry or softened by nostalgia. It is the raw engine of violence, loyalty, and terror that kept his empire alive deep in the unforgiving Sertão. The first thing that struck those who survived long enough to whisper rumors was not the landscape, but the atmosphere. An invisible tension hung over the camp like heat on cracked earth. New recruits were not greeted, they were measured. Every glance, every breath, every hesitation was a potential threat waiting to be tested. Inside that camp, Lampião was not a folk hero. He was a ruler whose authority needed no explanation, only obedience. That psychological dominance was not accidental. It was engineered through rituals of intimidation, secret punishments, and silent demonstrations, meant to remind everyone that stepping out of line did not mean being expelled. It meant disappearing. And the strangest part is how ordinary the brutality seemed to those inside. Stories describe moments when laughter and fear coexisted in ways that defy moral understanding. One second, the group shared food cooked over a rough fire, and the next, they watched someone endure a punishment designed to carve the rules into the mind of anyone watching. The duality was deliberate. It kept everyone emotionally unbalanced, dependent on Lampião for safety, approval, and identity. In that environment, the line between loyalty and survival blurred into something indistinguishable. But the most disturbing truth was not the violence itself. It was the system behind it, the psychological machinery that turned cruelty into order. Nothing happened without purpose. Every scar, every scream, every whispered threat served to reinforce a hierarchy that worked far more efficiently than chains or walls. Outsiders saw outlaws. Insiders lived inside a labyrinth of fear, admiration, and ritualized brutality that shaped who they became long before the world labeled them criminals. As we step deeper into the hidden layers of this forgotten world, I want to know your thoughts too, because understanding this story reshapes how we see myth, power, and human behavior. Have you ever imagined what truly held a group like Lampião's together? What you are about to uncover might challenge everything you believed about the Cangaceiros. Share your thoughts in the comments, leave your like, and make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss what comes next, because the next layer of this story pushes us even further into the shadows where this world begins to reveal itself. What truly set Lampião's hidden camp apart was not just its brutality, but the way the landscape itself seemed to collaborate with him. The deeper you moved into the Caatinga, the more the world narrowed into a maze of thorns, dust, and silence. Paths twisted like traps designed by nature, and Lampião learned to use every inch of that terrain as if it were an extension of his own mind. The camp did not simply sit in it disappeared into it. To an outsider, it was nothing more than a tangle of vegetation and stone, but to the Cangaceiros who lived under its invisible rules, it was a fortress crafted with precision and intent. Survivors and informants would later describe how approaching the camp felt like walking into a threshold where ordinary logic failed. The colors changed first, fading into tones that matched the leather, the dust, and the faces hardened by sun and war. Even the sounds shifted. Animal calls blended with human movements until the border between life and danger dissolved into a single pulse. The place was not defended by walls or watchtowers. It was defended by the certainty that anyone unfamiliar with its rhythms would be exposed within minutes. The vegetation itself became a weapon, scraping skin, slowing steps, swallowing tracks, and magnifying the smallest sound. Inside, the layout was intentionally deceptive. Nothing appeared where you expected it to be. Fires were built low to avoid smoke revealing their position. Sleeping areas were scattered, never clustered, so that an attack would have to strike a dozen directions at once. Hideouts were carved into natural formations, giving the illusion that the band vanished into stone whenever danger approached. Tunnels of thorn bushes funneled movement, forcing outsiders into predictable paths, while giving the Cangaceiros the freedom to strike from angles impossible to anticipate. Every space carried meaning. Nothing was accidental, not even the shadows that stretched between the trees. What outsiders never understood is that this environment did not just protect the camp, it transformed the people living in it. Days under the merciless sun and nights drowned in silence reshaped their instincts. They became hyperalert, conditioned to notice the smallest disturbance, trained to read a broken twig or a missing bird call as if it were a message. The land taught them to survive, but Lampião taught them to weaponize that survival. Together, the wilderness and the warlord forged a mentality where normal fear ceased to exist and was replaced by something sharper, something that felt like anticipation mixed with purpose. This is why so many failed to capture or infiltrate the camp. It was more than a hideout. It was a psychological barrier, a place where anyone who did not belong felt as though they were trespassing into an environment designed to reject them. Even seasoned soldiers from the Volantes found themselves disoriented, drained, and on edge long before they reached the heart of the encampment. Meanwhile, the Cangaceiros moved with an ease that seemed almost supernatural, as if the Sertão itself had chosen sides. And yet, this setting was only the outer shell of the world we are uncovering. Beneath the camouflage, beneath the heat and thorns, there were deeper forces shaping how the group functioned. The land protected their bodies, but something far more calculated was shaping their minds, tightening the bonds of fear, loyalty, and dominance. As we push further into the camp, those psychological structures begin to rise from the shadows, revealing that survival in this world was never just physical. It was something far more intricate and far more dangerous. What held the camp together was not only the terrain or Lampião's authority, but an invisible structure of rules that shaped every movement, every breath, every interaction among the Cangaceiros. These rules were not written, nor were they spoken openly. They existed like a second heartbeat inside the camp, a silent code that everyone learned through observation, fear, and consequence. New members understood quickly that survival depended not on strength alone, but on reading the emotional temperature of the group, deciphering subtle signals, and anticipating Lampião's expectations before he voiced them. In this world, hesitation was dangerous. Every man and woman needed to project certainty, even when they felt none. A misplaced expression, an unintended pause, a gesture interpreted as disrespect could shift the balance instantly. The Cangaceiros lived in a state of permanent alertness, yet they moved with practiced coordination, as if bound by threads of discipline woven so tightly that stepping outside them felt unnatural. This was not a military structure enforced by drills. It was psychological conditioning operating beneath conscious awareness. Lampião understood that fear alone was unreliable. Fear breaks people, but a blend of fear, admiration, and belonging could forge something unshakable. Tests of loyalty emerged in moments that felt spontaneous but were carefully calculated. A command delivered unexpectedly, a demand to prove obedience, a decision made in front of the group to reveal who aligned with Lampião without question. These moments were as revealing as the punishments that followed disobedience. To refuse was unthinkable, yet to comply meant surrendering a piece of oneself. Over time, this system carved identities to fit the needs of the camp. Individuals transformed into extensions of the hierarchy, adapting to expectations that shifted depending on Lampião's moods, strategies, and suspicions. Silence played a crucial role. Talking too much was dangerous. Asking questions was almost a form of defiance. So much of camp life unfolded through glances, nods, and the careful reading of emotional The lack of explicit instruction forced recruits to internalize the code deeply, learning through mistakes that were rarely forgiven. This environment rewarded those who adapted quickly and punished those who hesitated. Within weeks, even the most rebellious personalities began to mirror the group, shaped by pressure that was constant but not always visible. The hierarchy extended beyond rank. It shaped sleeping arrangements, access to food distribution of loot, and proximity to Lampião himself. Privilege was not granted lightly. and those who held it knew how fragile it was. A single misstep could strip everything away, yet proximity to Lampião offered not only material benefits, but psychological ones. A sense of identity, purpose, and protection that made loyalty feel less like submission and more like necessity. Many Cangaceiros believed there was no life beyond the camp. The code made sure they felt this way. Even relationships were regulated by the invisible rules. Friendships formed, but carefully. Rivalries simmered but rarely surfaced openly, unless Lampião allowed them to. No one wanted to be perceived as too close to another member, nor too isolated. Balance was survival. The atmosphere became a web of unspoken boundaries, emotional traps, and subtle alliances that could shift from day to day. Every decision had weight, because every action could be interpreted as a message. This silent system was the backbone of the camp, the mechanism that kept dozens of volatile individuals aligned under one leader without walls, chains, or formal discipline. But beneath this structure lurked something darker, a set of practices that turned fear into ritual and punishment into spectacle, revealing the true depth of the brutality shaping life inside Lampião's hidden domain. What emerged next inside Lampião's hidden camp was a form of communication built through suffering, a system where torture was not merely punishment but a language of power. It was through these brutal displays that the silent code gained teeth, becoming impossible to ignore or misinterpret. Every Cangaceiro knew that once someone crossed an invisible line, the response would not be a warning or a reprimand. It would be a demonstration, and these demonstrations carried more weight than any spoken rule ever could. Accounts from captured Cangaceiros and rare testimonies from infiltrators describe scenes that felt almost ritualistic. A traitor, a suspected informant, or someone who defied Lampião's authority would be brought into the center of the camp where everyone could see. The punishment was not rushed. It unfolded with a calculated slowness that forced each person present to absorb every detail, the sounds, the fear, the trembling, the silence that followed each cry. No one looked away, because looking away could itself be interpreted as disloyalty. Lampião understood the psychological impact of controlled cruelty. He knew that pain, when displayed publicly, could bind the group together as effectively as loyalty. When one person suffered, the rest were reminded of the price of breaking the code. And yet, the brutality served another purpose as well. It established Lampião as both protector and executioner. The same man who enforced violence was also the one who shielded the group from the unforgiving world outside. To obey him meant safety. To betray him meant erasure. Some punishments involved beatings so severe that the victim could no longer stand. Others involved mutilations designed not necessarily to kill, but to mark the body with the consequences of disobedience. There were stories of knives heated until they glowed, of ropes tightened until flesh tore, of methods intended to make the pain unforgettable. And while these stories spread like ghosts across the Sertão, inside the camp they served a precise function. They stabilized the hierarchy and eliminated uncertainty. What made these moments even more disturbing was how the camp reacted afterward. The atmosphere did not collapse into chaos or horror. Instead, it seemed to settle into an eerie stillness. People went back to their tasks, cleaned their weapons, prepared food, or simply retreated to silence. The brutality became a thread woven into daily life. A reminder that stability inside the camp was always balanced on a blade. Loyalty was not only expected but enforced with a consistency that left no room for ambiguity. Yet beneath these displays, another layer existed, something more nuanced and far more dangerous. Torture was not only a punishment for betrayal, it was also a tool for shaping identity. It created an emotional threshold that each Cangaceiro had to confront, a moment when fear and commitment merged into something unbreakable. Those who endured punishment without breaking earned a dark respect. Those who witnessed it learned lessons they would never forget. And all of it fed into the myth of the camp as a place where survival required absolute submission to the hidden rules. But the psychological impact did not end with the punished individual. Everyone present felt the weight of the demonstration. The fear lingered long after the victim was removed, settling like dust over every conversation and interaction. It reminded them that the camp functioned not just through orders, but through unquestionable consequences, shaping each member's behavior in ways they barely recognized. And as this system grew more refined, it opened the door to practices even more disturbing. Methods that turned violence into a strategic message for the entire street. What outsiders rarely understood is that brutality inside Lampião's camp did not end with internal punishments. The violence radiated outward, turning the camp into a staging ground for messages meant to echo across the circle. Every body left behind, every mutilation performed with deliberate precision, every scene arranged like a grim tableau carried meaning. These were not acts of senseless cruelty. They were strategic signals crafted to travel farther than any messenger could ride. In regions where literacy was scarce and fear spread faster than rumor, a corpse displayed at sunrise could reshape an entire community's behavior by nightfall. The practice began with choosing the victim. Sometimes it was a captured soldier from the village. Other times it was a local informant, a rival cangaceiro, or someone who refused to cooperate with the band. Lampião never acted impulsively in these moments. He chose individuals whose fate would resonate with maximum psychological impact. By punishing one, he controlled hundreds. By displaying one body, he influenced the daily decisions of entire villages. Fear became a currency, and the camp was the mint where it was produced. After the execution, the camp prepared the display. Some bodies were left intact, positioned at crossroads or near water sources where passers-by were certain to find them. Others were marked with cuts or symbols associated with the Cangaço, transforming the corpse into a form of communication that required no words. Mutilation was not always used, but when it was, the message became unmistakable. It warned that betrayal was not merely punished, it was erased in a way designed to haunt the imagination of anyone who saw it. Even the positioning mattered. Bodies placed high on rocks suggested dominance over the land. Those left near settlements hinted that the Cangaceiros were close, watching, waiting. Sometimes objects were left beside the corpse, such as empty rifle shells or pieces of the victim's clothing, clues meant to force the viewer to interpret the meaning for themselves. The ambiguity amplified the terror. When people could not fully understand a threat, they assumed the worst, and Lampião counted on that instinct. Witnesses often described how the silence around these scenes felt unnatural, as if the air itself held its breath. Travelers stumbled upon bodies and turned back immediately, abandoning their roots. Villagers who discovered them in the early hours avoided speaking of the sight for days, fearing that even mentioning it aloud might draw the Cangaceiros' attention. The psychological weight of these displays was overwhelming. They created an atmosphere in which the very thought of resisting or informing became a risk no one wished to take. Inside the camp, these acts were understood as part of their survival strategy. The Cangaceiros saw them not as cruelty but as necessity. To them, the Sertão was a battlefield without clear borders, one where communication through fear was as essential as water or ammunition. This logic shaped not only how they fought, but how they existed day to day. They lived in a constant exchange with the land and its people, controlling territory not by occupying it, but by imprinting terror on the imagination of those who heard of their actions. Yet the deeper one looks into this system, the clearer it becomes that these displays were only a piece of a much larger machinery. The camp was not simply a den of violence, it was an ecosystem where punishment, ritual, loyalty, and survival merged into a single relentless force. And at its center stood a leader whose power extended far beyond weapons or strategies, reaching into the minds and fears of everyone who crossed his path. Inside Lampião's hidden camp, justice did not resemble a system. It resembled a storm, sudden, decisive, and terrifyingly precise. Every Cangaceiro knew that the rules governing punishment were not written down, yet they carried the weight of law. Lampião was judge, jury, and executioner, and his decisions appeared to materialize from a mixture of instinct, strategy, and an almost theatrical understanding of power. When someone violated the code, the response did not follow a predictable sequence. It began with silence, a kind of charged stillness that spread through the camp long before the guilty individual was summoned. That silence was often the first sign that something irreversible was about to occur. People stopped moving so quickly. Conversations became clipped. The air seemed to tighten around the group as Lampião observed from a distance, his gaze sharp enough to cut through any attempted denial or explanation. Punishments were not always immediate. Sometimes they came hours later, sometimes days. The waiting itself became part of the sentence, eroding the offender's resolve, twisting anxiety into submission. By the time the moment arrived, resistance had already dissolved. The forms of punishment varied depending on the nature of the offense and Lampião's mood, but they all carried a common purpose: to reassert the hierarchy and remind everyone who controlled life inside the camp. Some offenders were beaten in front of the entire group, their cries echoing across the thorn-covered hills. Others endured humiliations designed to fracture their pride, stripping away any sense of autonomy. There were cases in which Lampião forced the culprit to kneel before the group and confess, not because confession mattered, but because the act dissolved the boundary between self and submission. More severe violations brought consequences that left marks far deeper than bruises. Some punishments were intended to scar permanently, both physically and psychologically. A public lashing, a forced task that pushed the body to its breaking point, or a ritualized punishment that forced the offender to confront their failure again and again. What struck many observers was not the violence alone, but the surgical precision with which Lampião chose the method. He understood human vulnerability intimately. He knew what broke a man, what shamed him, what made him desperate to regain approval. Punishment, in this sense, became a form of manipulation that extended his power beyond the body and into the mind. Execution, however, was reserved for acts that threatened the structure of the camp itself. Betrayal, attempted desertion, or anything that placed the group in direct danger, triggered a response that felt swift yet deeply considered. Lampião sometimes carried out the execution personally, but more often he selected someone else, forcing them to participate in the act. This not only ensured compliance, but tied the group together through shared guilt, binding them to the system they feared. Once involved in a death, leaving the camp became nearly impossible. Their hands were marked, metaphorically, if not literally. Equally striking was how the camp behaved after these moments. The rhythm of daily life resumed as if nothing had happened. The transition was seamless, almost unsettling. People cooked, sharpened weapons, told stories, laughed even. It was not denial but adaptation. The Cangaceiros had learned to survive by compartmentalizing terror, by burying each memory beneath the next task, the next march, the next command. This emotional resilience created an environment where extreme violence coexisted with camaraderie, making the camp feel simultaneously like a family and a battlefield. Yet this system of justice did more than maintain order. It shaped identities. Each punishment reinforced the idea that belonging to the camp required sacrifice, obedience, and the acceptance of danger as a constant companion. To live under Lampião meant embracing a life where every choice carried weight, where every misstep cast a long shadow, and where loyalty was forged in the space between fear and necessity. And within this volatile world, some individuals experienced pressures far greater than others, especially those whose roles inside the camp made them both protected and exposed in ways outsiders barely imagined. Among all the layers of control inside Lampião's hidden camp, none were more complex or more perilous than the roles occupied by the women. Outsiders often imagine the Cangaço as a world dominated entirely by men, but inside the camp, women were central to its emotional pulse, its conflicts, and its darkest tensions. Maria Bonita, in particular, occupied a position that blended power and vulnerability in ways that few environments could sustain. She was both shielded and exposed, respected and envied, cherished and scrutinized. Her presence transformed the internal dynamics of the group, raising the stakes of loyalty, jealousy, affection, and punishment. Women in the camp lived under a dual weight: the dangers of the Sertão and the unpredictable emotional climate created by men who live with constant violence, shaping their instincts. Affections could turn into threats. Rivalries could implode without warning. A whispered insult, a perceived betrayal, or even an unintended gesture could escalate into conflict. Lampião treated the women as vital companions of the group, but he also treated them as symbols of his authority. Anyone who challenged that boundary, even indirectly, risked consequences far more severe than those for ordinary rule-breaking. For many women, the camp became a place where survival required a subtle intelligence that went far beyond physical endurance. They learned to read shifts in mood, to anticipate reactions before they surfaced, to navigate fragile alliances among the men, and to remain aware that their presence could ignite tensions without any intention on their part. Stories from survivors paint a picture of women who were neither passive victims nor free participants. They existed in a narrow corridor between influence and danger, constantly adapting to the emotional storms that shaped life under Lampião. Maria Bonita herself embodied this contradiction. She held a kind of informal authority that came from her proximity to Lampião, yet that authority offered no guarantee of safety. It merely raised the stakes. When disputes arose between Cangaceiros involving jealousy or resentment, the repercussions were often more brutal because these tensions touched the core of the leaders. Personal domain. A man who crossed boundaries involving the women did not merely violate a rule. He challenged Lampião's identity, and the resulting punishment reflected that deeper violation. Women also bore witness to the darkest aspects of camp life. They often saw the earliest signs of conflict forming, sensed the emotional fractures long before the men acknowledged them, and understood how close the group lived to internal collapse. Their testimonies, though rare, reveal insights that the men themselves rarely articulated. They saw what violence did to the minds around them. They saw how fear shaped affection, how power blurred into possession, and how love itself became intertwined with survival. Yet within this environment, women carved out moments of resilience and solidarity. They shared stories, patched wounds, prepared meals, and tried to maintain fragments of normal life inside a world ruled by tension. These small acts formed a quiet resistance against the chaos around them, but even these moments could not fully protect them from the volatility of the camp. When conflicts erupted, the women were often caught in the crossfire of blame, suspicion, or retribution. In some rare cases, the consequences for romantic disputes or accusations of infidelity became extraordinarily severe. Punishments targeting women were often delivered not only to discipline but to make an example, reinforcing the message that emotional disorder was as threatening to the camps. Survival as a military ambush, these punishments echoed across the group, shaping how everyone understood the boundaries of affection, loyalty, and desire. Women lived inside that tension every day, balancing fear with resilience in ways that remain largely unspoken in historical accounts. Their presence exposes how the camp was never just a military formation. It was a volatile human ecosystem, one in which emotion, power, and survival collided constantly, and where the women stood. Those collisions became impossible to ignore, revealing the raw human cost of living inside Lampião's hidden world. As the emotional currents of the camp shifted unpredictably, another force quietly shaped the Cangaceiros' worldview, one that existed long before guns and ambushes defined their lives. Beneath the leather, beneath the violent, there was a deep well of superstition and ritual that threaded through every decision, every march, every night spent under the vast Sertão sky. These beliefs were not ornamental. They were essential, guiding Lampião and his followers through a world where physical danger was constant and spiritual danger felt just as real. The camp was not only a base of operations, it was a space where the visible and the invisible blended in ways that outsiders rarely understood. Many Cangaceiros wore amulets blessed by local resideiras, small objects they believed could turn bullets aside, confuse enemies, or offer protection from betrayal. Some carried tiny cloth packets filled with herbs, animal parts, or soil from sacred sites. Others followed personal rituals they would not discuss, gestures performed at dawn or midnight that they believed aligned them with unseen forces. These practices were not questioned within the camp. They were accepted as part of the rhythm of life, as natural as sharpening a knife or cleaning a rifle. Lampião himself placed great weight on spiritual protection, Despite his reputation as a hardened strategist, he trusted in rituals that blended Catholic imagery with folk magic and Afro-Brazilian influences. Before certain raids, he sought guidance from individuals believed to possess supernatural insight. These consultations shaped not only the timing of attacks, but also the route the group took, the moment they struck, or whether they struck at all. Decisions that seemed impulsive or unpredictable to the volantes were often rooted in signs, dreams, or omens, interpreted only within the confines of the hidden camp. Nightfall was when the spiritual atmosphere became most palpable. The Sertão, already a place of silence and shadows, seemed to amplify the rituals. Small fires were used to heat objects for blessings or to burn herbs believed to summon protection. Some Cangaceiros sat apart, drawing symbols in the dirt or whispering prayers taught by parents long before they took up arms. Others gathered around storytellers who recounted tales of spirits that roamed the Caatinga, reinforcing the idea that the group was never alone, even in the most remote corners of the wilderness. These beliefs served a purpose far beyond comfort. They helped the Cangaceiros cope with the psychological strain of their violent lives. When each day threatened death, spiritual rituals provided a sense of control, a framework for interpreting events that otherwise felt random and brutal. If an ambush succeeded, it might be attributed to the power of a blessing. If a bullet missed its mark, perhaps the amulet absorbed its intent. This belief system became a protective shield around the mind, reinforcing resilience in a reality that demanded constant alertness. At the same time, the rituals created a shared identity. Every man and woman in the camp, regardless of their past, stepped into a spiritual world that was larger than them. These practices unified the group, offering a sense of destiny that elevated their battles into something almost mythic. To them, survival did not depend solely on weapons or strategy, but on forces intertwined with fate itself. This mindset gave Lampião a psychological advantage, reinforcing his authority as both a war leader and a figure touched in their eyes by something beyond the ordinary. Yet these beliefs were not without their shadows. When omens suggested danger, tension inside the camp intensified. When dreams hinted at betrayal, suspicion grew. Rituals meant to offer protection sometimes exposed fractures, revealing fears too deep for words. The camp lived inside this spiritual turbulence, carrying charms and stories as carefully as they carried rifles, convinced that what moved in the unseen world shaped everything they faced in the visible one. And as these practices guided them through uncertainty, another force was cultivating itself inside the camp, a force that blended violence, survival, and opportunity in ways that would redefine how the Cangaceiros operated across the Sertão. While superstition shaped the emotional core of camp, another engine operated beneath the surface, one far more practical and far more revealing of how the Cangaço sustained itself across years of pursuit. This was the camp's hidden economy, a system where brutality, discipline, and opportunity merged into a structure that functioned with startling efficiency. Outsiders often imagined the Cangaceiros as chaotic marauders, drifting unpredictably across the surface. Yet inside the camp, the distribution of loot, resources, weapons, and information followed a logic as sharp as any blade they carried. It was an economy of necessity, forged in scarcity and cemented by fear. The foundation of this system was the spoils taken from raids: gold, jewelry, livestock, fabrics, food, and ammunition piled into the camp after each operation, creating a flow of resources that needed constant management. These items were not simply scattered or hoarded without purpose. Lampião oversaw their distribution with the same intensity he applied to strategy or discipline. He knew precisely which man needed new boots, which woman lacked a garment, which soldier required more cartridges, and which member of the group was falling behind in performance. Distribution became a subtle way of reinforcing loyalty. Those who demonstrated unwavering obedience found themselves supplied. Those who faltered felt scarcity creep into their lives. Weapons flowed through the camp in the same way. Rifles captured from the volantes ammunition obtained from sympathetic merchants, and blades forged locally were assigned according to skill and reliability. A man trusted with a rare repeating rifle understood that losing it meant consequences. A recruit handed a dull knife knew he still had much to prove. The very tools of survival became indicators of status, shaping how each person perceived their place within the group. Even repairs carried symbolic weight. A gun cleaned by Lampião's inner circle was a gesture of favor. One left, neglected, signaled a warning. Food functioned as a currency too. The camp could not rely on hunting alone, and raids on farms or convoys were essential. Meat, beans, farinha, and sometimes sugar or coffee were gathered and stored, then rationed in a way that reinforced hierarchy. Those closest to Lampião ate slightly better, slightly earlier, or slightly more often. These differences were small, but in the harsh Sertão they carved invisible lines inside the group, lines every Cangacero felt even when nothing was said aloud. Hunger sharpened obedience. Satisfaction dulled resentment. Trade networks also expanded beyond the camp. Some villagers, whether sympathetic or terrified, exchanged goods for protection. Others provided information about police movement or rival groups. These exchanges were risky for everyone involved, yet they formed a shadow economy that stretched across vast distances. Lampião turned fear into leverage and loyalty into profit. Every transaction, whether material or psychological, fed back into the camp's internal machinery. But the most unsettling aspect of this economy was how seamlessly violence intertwined with it. Brutality was not simply emotional or disciplinary. It was part of the camp's financial strategy. A public punishment discouraged theft within the group. A displayed corpse kept entire towns from withholding resources. The threat of retaliation ensured that those who supplied the Cangaceiros continued doing so. In this system, violence became a regulating force, the equivalent of laws and contracts in more stable societies. The economy also created dependencies. Cangaceiros who received weapons, clothing, or food from the camp found themselves tied to its structure in ways they could not easily escape. Even those who dreamed of leaving understood that walking away meant abandoning the only support system they had. There was no safe alternative waiting for them beyond the thorny walls of the camp. The economy trapped them as effectively as chains might have, though none were ever used. This interwoven system of resources and control revealed that the Cangaço was not merely a rebellion or a band of fugitives. It was an organized entity, a moving fortress of people shaped by scarcity, opportunity, and the relentless need to survive. But beneath this organized flow of materials and power, a final force awaited, one that would determine the fate of Lampião, his followers, and the legacy that would outlive them long after the camp itself vanished into dust. What ultimately emerged from Lampião's hidden camp was not only a system of violence, ritual, and hierarchy, but a mythology forged in real time by the very people who lived inside its boundaries. Every punishment, every whispered rule, every superstition, and every distribution of loot fed into a larger story that transformed Lampião from a man into a symbol. To his followers, he became the axis around which their world turned. To his enemies, he became a specter who moved through the Sertão with uncanny precision. Yet behind this legend stood a structure as fragile as it was fearsome, built on the tension between loyalty and terror, opportunity and desperation, destiny and doom. As the camp evolved, the cost of maintaining this world grew heavier. The strategies that once protected the group began to strain under increasing pressure. The volantes, though often disorganized, learned from each failed ambush. Regions that once offered silence now echoed with distant gunfire. The network of informants expanded, and betrayals that previously felt unthinkable began to sprout from hunger, exhaustion, or fear. Even the spiritual rituals that guided Lampião started to feel less like armor and more like warnings. As omens multiplied and doubts crept quietly into the hearts of those who once felt invincible, inside the camp, subtle fractures formed amidst sign, a wrong interpretation, a decision made too late or too soon. The once fluid machinery of survival began to grind against itself. Some Cangaceiros questioned raids that offered little reward. Others sensed that the Sertão, which had once sheltered them, was tightening like a noose. Still, no one dared speak aloud what many felt, that the forces surrounding them had begun to shift in ways they could no longer control. The women felt this change first, sensing how tension seeped into ordinary routines. The men felt it in the weight of their weapons, in the diminishing supplies, in the cautious glances exchanged during quiet moments. Even Lampião, though outwardly unshaken, moved with a sharpened awareness that suggested he knew the landscape of power was changing. His authority no longer radiated effortlessly. It burned hotter, tighter, as if fueled by the urgency of a man who understood that the world he built was reaching a breaking point. Yet none of these shifts diminished the intensity of their bond. If anything, the looming sense of danger strengthened. The camp became a crucible where loyalty and fear fused more deeply than ever. Every member understood that abandoning the structure meant stepping into a world that would never forgive them. The legend of Lampião had grown too large. It cast long shadows, and anyone who tried to escape them risked being swallowed whole. They remained not because they believed the future was secure, but because walking away meant erasing their identity entirely. As the final days of the camp approached, the atmosphere felt suspended, charged with a mixture of defiance and inevitability. The Cangaceiros sharpened their blades, prepared their rifles, and moved through familiar routines with a precision that hinted at resignation. They had become part of a story that had outgrown them, a story that would soon collide with forces stronger than superstition, harsher than punishment, and more relentless than the Sertão itself. And through this collision, the myth of Lampião would transform again, shifting from fear into legend, from legend into history, from history into something darker and far more enduring. If you stayed with me to this point, leave a comment saying this story follows me into the shadows, so I know you reached the end. And if this journey through the hidden world of the Cangaço brought you new insight, consider subscribing so you can follow the next chapter of these untold histories. A like helps this story find others who are searching for the truth behind the myths. And if you want to keep exploring, there is another video waiting right beside this one, ready to take you even deeper into the world these outlaws left behind.